We have a certain intuition about what objects will feel like and what we can do with them just by looking at them. We call these affordances. Take, for example, this piece of paper and this apple. I know from my previous experience with paper that I can easily pick it up, I can twist it, I can tear it, and so on. I know that the apple has greater mass, it'll be harder to pick up, but that I can throw it up or even take a bite out of it. Now, these learned expectations help us to quickly recognize how we can interact with objects. Now, completely recreating real-world objects in our UIs can be limiting and have some adverse effects. We can, however, take advantage of some of these basic principles of affordances and tangibility to make our UIs more intuitive. In material design, we imagine UIs to be composed of pieces of digital paper, which we call surfaces. Now, these surfaces have tangible attributes to imply real-world behaviors, but they aren't limited like the real-world equivalents. Everything on the screen lives in one of these surfaces, including all text, icons, photos, buttons, any UI element really. Now, these surfaces have a tiny amount of physicality, just enough to show that one thing is distinct from another and how they sit relative to one another. This taps into our instinctive ability to quickly recognize objects. There's no need to take the metaphor too far and use real-world textures, sheens, specular highlights, or so on. Just the smallest set of real-world cues are enough to express a lot of meaning. Surfaces also exist in 3D space, with varying widths and heights and at different elevations. These surfaces are arranged in front of and behind one another and cast shadows on lower surfaces. So here we can see as the fab raises up in elevation, it casts a more diffuse shadow. Let's take a small detour and really focus in about how and why shadows get cast by surfaces. In general, objects that are closer to us command more of our visual attention, and we can tell which objects are closer based on their size and how they cover and cast shadows on the things that are behind them. So we can use depth as a cue in our UI to direct attention to important elements. So how do we use these concepts on a 2D screen? We use the shadows to convey a surface's elevation relative to other surfaces. Surfaces nearer to you will cast a larger shadow. There's a lot of complicated maths behind how to draw these shadows correctly, but luckily on Android we only have to edit a bit of code and to have the shadows drawn dynamically for us. Let's take a quiz to test you a little on how this hierarchy works. Given this interface, rank the components by their elevation. Let's take a look at the answer. That's right, this floating circular button here casts a large shadow on the other surfaces in our interface, so it must be the highest surface. Next is the blue surface just below it, and then lowest in the hierarchy is the background surface. You might not have caught it, but there is a slight shadow that the blue surface is casting on the background. Just by looking at the screen, even without any text or icons to guide us, we can immediately establish a sense of the hierarchy of these UI elements, the higher ones commanding the most visual attention. A surface is a container for your content and provides grouping and separation from other elements. But there are other lighter weight ways to visually group the content, so when should you create a surface? Let's look at an example. Here we have a surface for the app bar and a surface for each list item. The issue here is that the surfaces act as a kind of cognitive speed bump. While it's useful to visually separate the app bar from the content, placing each item on an individual surface lowers your speed in scanning down the list. A much cleaner approach is to simply draw the content on a single surface using a subtle separator. Conversely, in this example, placing each of these very different items onto their own separate surface lets you visually process each one individually. A good rule of thumb is that if content is homogeneous, when scanning and comparison will be important, then it likely belongs on a single surface. If you need to present a collection of heterogeneous items, then individual surfaces are appropriate. Directing attention is a powerful technique, but needs to be used judiciously. Having too many separate surfaces on a screen at once can be distracting. As a very rough rule of thumb, try not to have more than around 5 surfaces on the screen at once.